Good evening, everybody. For those who don't know, my name is Matt Walpole. I am the recently appointed Senior Director for Conservation Programs at Fauna Flora International, and it is my job tonight to lead us through this evening's event. As you all know, the topic for this evening is what makes conservation a success, and how do we know if we've achieved it? Those of you who were here for the AGM a little earlier will recall Joe talking about some of our conservation successes and acknowledging that conservation is rarely, if ever, easy. Wherever we work, we are confronted by complex challenges and multiple threats. Every one of those situations is unique, which means that there's no real blueprint for conservation. We're often trying to ensure we're learning from our experiences on our projects elsewhere and applying that learning and our judgment to the work we do in order to find solutions that will be long-lasting. The one thing perhaps that binds all of our projects is something that each one of them has, which is a clear idea and a vision of where they're trying to go, of what success looks like. What is our ultimate conservation aim in the projects that we're running? Now, in some cases, it's a short-term thing. What we're trying to do is to avert an immediate, unforeseen crisis, disaster event that's taken place. But in many cases, we're looking to a far longer-term solution, a far longer-term result. What we're trying to do, inevitably, is to improve the prospects for species and for habitats and ecosystems. And how do we know if we've got there? Well, it may be because we're seeing a reduction in the rate of loss of those focal species or habitats. Hopefully, we're seeing improvements, rising populations. Possibly we're seeing a change in the outlook for species. So species that have for many years been critically endangered, we hope when they're reassessed, we start to see them coming down the red list to a threatened or least concern status. So seeing that forecast change for a long-term and resilient future for those species and those ecosystems is what we're all about in our projects. Now, the key thing here is that that kind of effort takes time. Seeing those kinds of change in the world can take 10, 20, 30 years, decades. But we can't wait that long to ask the question, have we succeeded? So how do we know? Well, in each of our projects, we're thinking about what it takes to get to those ultimate conservation success stories. What are the stepping stones? What are the steps along the way that give us confidence that if we're seeing small change, we know we're on the right path towards that ultimate change and success we're trying to achieve in terms of species recoveries, improvements for ecosystems. And those things, again, will be very different in every project, but the key is that we understand them and we track them. It may be something simple like an increased awareness of the challenge and the issues amongst those who can make a difference. It may be a difference in terms of an increased commitment from governments or from a company to act differently in ways that are going to achieve conservation gains. It may be that we're seeing actual behavior change amongst those who are influencing and affecting species and habitats. It may be that we can actually measure a reduction in threat, whether that is overhunting, whether that is the threat of some development, a road or a mine or whatever it might be. These are all steps along the journey towards our ultimate conservation goals. And every one of our projects is on a journey of its own. And in every case, that journey is based on a logic. We ask each of our project managers to identify at the outset what are the steps that are needed to get to that ultimate solution. So we can really judge whether the actions we're planning to take are going to lead us to the outcomes, the results, and the impacts that we're aiming to achieve. And as an organization, again, as we heard earlier, we review that on a very regular basis. We can ask the question of each of our projects, how far are you along that journey? How far are you in terms of those stepping stones that you need to achieve to get to that ultimate conservation gain? That, I think, is something that we at FFI are very proud of, because it means we can create the kind of stories of change and success and optimism which conservation really needs to drive itself forward. Two things, though, that I would add to that. One is that that path, that journey, is very rarely straight. It's a winding path of short-term successes, other challenges and failures. We're never sure what's going to happen next in many of these projects. We can never foresee the kind of events that may take place and may happen. That will take us off the path. and means that we are constantly having to reevaluate how we get back on it and move forward. The other key thing I would say is that we rarely do this alone. Conservation is a huge effort, and it demands a lot of partners and a lot of collaboration. And I think for FFI, perhaps certainly the way we feel about this, some of our greatest achievements and successes are where we've actually been able to support and nurture local conservationists and local conservation organisations to achieve their own aspirations. And it's through others that we can have a far, far greater impact than we can simply working on our own. Now, this evening, we're going to hear two very different and contrasting stories of change in FFI's projects, which I hope will illustrate something of how we as FFI approach these issues and the extent to which we understand and can learn from the experience of driving conservation forward and achieving real change. Firstly, I would like to invite Tanya Cox to join us. Tanya is our project manager for our marine plastics work, and Tanya's going to talk about some of the efforts and successes that we've had in terms of UK policy and legislation. Tanya, over to you.
In recent years, the subject of plastic pollution has become a hot topic, and sadly, most of us are familiar with images such as this. The impacts of plastics on marine life have become increasingly apparent. Animals get entangled in plastic and often mistake them for food, causing suffocation or starvation. And seabird autopsies reveal the extent to which their guts are becoming filled with plastic rather than food. Plastic pollution is clearly a serious threat to life in the oceans, but the question is, where is it all coming from? I often find it hard to believe that industrial plastic production really only began in the 1950s, and this magazine cover from 1955 actually celebrated throwaway living as the solution to all of our household chores. But today, of course, we know that there is no away. That plastic has to go somewhere. Inadequacies in waste management and recycling capabilities worldwide, coupled with soaring production rates in recent decades, means more and more plastic is escaping and ending up in our waterways and our seas. While the presence and impacts of larger items of plastic, or microplastics, has been very clear, it is only in the last 7 or 8 years that the world has become more aware of a more insidious risk from plastic pollution. By chance, scientists monitoring plankton communities discovered that their samples were contaminated with tiny pieces of plastic measuring less than 5 millimeters and often invisible to the naked eye. Initially, these so-called microplastics were found to come from the breakdown of larger items of plastic debris. But with more investigation, it actually became apparent that some forms of microplastics were directly released into our oceans. So why is this a problem? Quite simply, microplastics are of a size which means they can be eaten by a plethora of marine life. For example, these are pre-production plastic pellets, or nurdles as we like to call them, and they are essentially the building blocks of the plastic industry. As a consequence of poor housekeeping, spilt nurdles often get swept into the drains in industrial facilities and flow out to sea. They are about the size of a lentil and have been found in the stomach of fish and birds, such as the iconic puffins around the UK, probably because they are visually very similar to fish eggs, and particularly when suspended in the water column. Similarly, even smaller particles of plastic, such as those which have been commonly used in facial scrubs and other toiletries, are taken up by tiny filter feeders at the bottom of the food chain. Not only do microplastics get trapped in the digestive systems of the animals that eat them, they have also been shown to concentrate persistent bioaccumulating toxins such as DDT, which is already present in the sea. This effectively renders microplastics tiny, poisonous pills. With clear evidence of these pollutants being passed and potentially concentrated up the food chain, it not only confirms the seriousness of this issue for this little guy who's at the bottom of the food chain, but it also calls into question the safety of the seafood that we're consuming. FFI was the first biodiversity organisation to develop a specific programme of work on microplastics. Our early investigations and conversations with scientists from 2009 onwards identified this as a potentially important subject with huge ramifications for marine conservation. and we were able to formally launch our program in 2012 before the compelling scientific evidence was finally published and the issue became mainstream. We focused on microplastics because at the time this was an emerging issue, which meant it was not being covered by others and there was a gap in what was already being done. There was a clear and direct biodiversity impact, not only from the breakdown of plastics in the environment, but from these direct sources of microplastics that were immediately available to the marine organisms in the environment. And crucially, we identified clear and tractable solutions, which meant that we could effectively turn off the tap on these sources of plastics, a more effective way of tackling the problem than trying to clear up these tiny particles. Our first focus was the issue of microbeads. These microplastics were being purposefully added to the toiletries that we all use on a daily basis and which were designed to be washed off and go straight down the drain. It was clear from emerging research that there was no way that sewage treatment plants could capture these tiny granules, so they flowed unimpeded to our rivers and our seas. What really concerned us was that having innocently used our toothpaste, our scrubs, and our bubble baths at home, we were unwittingly contributing to this form of pollution because our bathrooms are directly connected to our waterways. However, we knew that this was a preventable problem. Biodegradable alternatives had been used for decades before and were still being used by many manufacturers. FFI saw that businesses had both an opportunity and a responsibility to change their practices to eliminate this particular source of pollution. And with that, the concept for the Good Scrub Guide was born. So we started doing our research, and what followed was a mind-boggling immersion into the world of personal care. Who knew that lip exfoliators actually existed? By regularly patrolling Cambridge's High Street, much to the bemusement of all of the shop assistants, I'm sure, we developed a comprehensive database of different products and their ingredients, and were appalled to find that about 50% of all of the facial scrubs we looked at that time contained plastic ingredients. By the way, this is a photo of my colleague Dee, which is probably doing the rounds of the Boots security team tonight. One of the most common complaints I hear relating to product labeling is that the writing is just too small to read, and I have to say, I hear you. I think between the team, we've now ogled over the ingredient lists of some 1,500 products to work out where these microplastics were lurking. I don't think that any of us thought our conservation fieldwork would evolve to monitoring supermarket aisles, but this really did underpin the success of the project. I have been told, and I probably have to admit, that during this time we've become plastic geeks, and we now know our polyethylene from our polypropylene. But as I'll explain later, this is actually becoming very handy. The reality is that the science behind the ingredient used in these products is extremely complex, and it makes identifying plastics really quite difficult, so much so that even the manufacturers, in some cases, aren't certain if their ingredients are plastic or not. So we have had to do an awful lot of homework with some very patient chemists. The data we collected eventually covered the products from around 300 different brands and was used to launch the Good Scrub Guide in 2013. By providing a list of plastic-free scrubs for all budgets, the guide served a number of purposes. Firstly, it helped us raise awareness and inform consumer choices. And secondly, it gave us a platform from which to positively engage with companies who respond to those consumer choices and their own responsibilities. We asked Marine Conservation Society, a prominent UK charity, to partner on this work, and together we wrote to 40 companies challenging them to consider their use of microbeads. Some of these companies, such as Neal's Yard Remedies, had proudly never used plastics and never will, whereas others committed to change and stopped using plastic ingredients, and this included big names such as Boots and M&S. At the time, this was a real sign of success for the programme, that we could have this type of influence and that these firms would make such voluntary commitments on the back of our engagement. In addition to the Good Scrub Guide, we work with a wide range of NGOs around the world to bring the issue into the wider public realm. This included developing a smartphone app which consumers could use to scan products for plastics. This, coupled with an early campaign in the UK that we ran jointly with Marine Conservation Society, encouraged people to pledge to scrub it out and choose plastic-free products wherever possible, using both the guide and the app to inform their choices. Generally, when people found out the extent to which plastic ingredients were being used in everyday products, including in children's toothpaste, there was an overwhelming sense of disgust. Over the next couple of years, we saw a broader recognition of this issue, with significant press coverage of the microbead story, and in time this was then picked up by other NGOs, and indeed championed in the press, as this Daily Mail headline clearly demonstrates. As a result of the concerted and coordinated efforts of a range of NGOs, the first sign of political interest became apparent in the US, where our colleagues had convinced the Obama administration to take action and ban the bead. Back on this side of the pond, and despite our efforts and successes in gaining voluntary commitments, there were still a number of companies that were not taking note. It was clear that legislation would be needed to mop up these last unwilling companies, and indeed there was clear pressure from those who were taking responsible action to create a level playing field so that those actions didn't disadvantage their businesses. In 2016, we formed a coalition with 3 other environmental organisations: Greenpeace UK, Marine Conservation Society, and the Environmental Investigation Agency, to promote broader action on microbeads. A petition led by Greenpeace gained more than 300,000 signatures, which in turn gained the attention of Parliament, and the issue was referred to the UK Government's Environmental Audit Committee. Now, this is where our plastic geekery truly came into its own. Of the coalition, we were the organisation who had been working on the issue for the longest. We had the greatest understanding of the science involved, the constraints faced, and oftentimes the excuses used by industry. We were well placed to take the stand in front of the committee. My colleague Dan, here on the right in this photo, alongside our coalition partners, proudly made the case for the need to create a strong and clear ban to remove microbeads from consumer products. During the grueling hearing, FFI made the technical arguments on behalf of the coalition and was able to clarify many of the issues raised and answer a multitude of questions asked during the hearing. The published recommendations from the Environmental Audit Committee to the UK Government made specific reference to FFI's suggested approach to implementing the ban. The clear rationale behind our messaging united all of the organisations, and together we were able to align the public, the media, the industry and the scientific community to make the case for a clear and robust ban. This was the culmination of 4 years' work by this point, and the statement behind me certainly makes all of those hours of chemistry lessons and cosmetic trawling worthwhile. In September 2016, the UK Government committed to ban microbeads. This action would prevent any further pollution from facial scrubs and associated products. And following a detailed consultation period at the start of this year, the ban was later confirmed by Michael Gove in July. FFI has made history once again. In just 4 short years, and following the launch of the Good Scrub Guide, FFI successfully raised the profile of a previously unrecognised issue that posed a serious threat to marine biodiversity. Through strategic collaboration and effective relationship building, the issue became mainstream and culminated with legislative action, which is a really unusual result in the world of conservation. We've been reflecting on why we think it is that our approach has worked, and we put it down to 3 key factors. We were clear, constructive, and consistent from the beginning. All of our work and communications were based on sound scientific knowledge and a total immersion into the world of polymer chemistry. Through the Good Scrub Guide, we took a complex issue and made it accessible to all by telling a story that people could really connect with. And we promoted the opportunity for companies to take responsible positions by showcasing popular plastic-free products across all budgets and not only the ethical ranges. And finally, we openly collaborated with other organisations in a coalition who at times had very different approaches to us. And although this might have been challenging, we saw that ultimately the complementary approaches added value. We are immensely proud of the success to date in turning off the tap on microbeads, but we do realise that there is much more to be done to tackle the plastic pollution affecting our oceans. We continue to work to see if there are products outside of the scope of the current ban, which could also present a meaningful form of plastic pollution. For example, we've been shocked to find the proportion of some makeups which is made up of plastic polymers. In addition to all of the work that's gone into the microbead ban over the past 4 years, we have also been working to tackle the loss of nurdles, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm happy to report that we're beginning to see traction and the first signs of success in terms of positive changes by individual companies, retailers, trade associations, and policymakers across Europe. Incidentally, I do have a few examples of these different types of microplastics, which are in the common room if you'd like to have a look at the end of the presentations this evening. We've been looking to find opportunities to influence other sources of microplastic pollution, such as those coming from synthetic clothing, like in this image. These flow out into our waterways via domestic washing machines. And finally, we're working with our wider FFI team and our partners across all 46 marine sites to identify opportunities to deal with site-specific sources of marine pollution, be they microplastics or larger types of plastic, which find their way into the seas where we're working. Although we may have won the battle on microbeads, we know we haven't won the war on marine plastics, and the fight goes on. Thank you.
So what a powerful story, and I think a surprising one too. Because when we think about the kind of work that organisations like FFI do, it's tempting to think of it involving being out there in the field, monitoring species, fighting the fight on the ground where these threats take place. But, you know, to conserve things like this doesn't always mean putting on a pair of flippers and a snorkel and patrolling a marine protected area. This kind of work is vital to alleviating the threats to the species that we're trying to conserve. So I think it's fantastic, and I think it also illustrates something about the ethos of FFI and the way that we operate. And the kind of words we like to use to describe ourselves include innovative, responsive, doing work that's based on sound science, and working in effective partnership. And I think this is a great example of all four of those. So excellent, well done. The other thing I think that this at least tells me is that whilst we talk quite a lot about the great partners we work with around the world and how important they are, the other key element here is the fantastic staff we have running these projects. Committed, creative, responsive, fantastic. So again, a big well done. I think it's an excellent project. Talking of fantastic, committed, excellent staff, Jenny. I'd like to introduce Jenny Daltry. Jenny is our senior conservation biologist and also the head and lead of our Caribbean work. Jenny's been with FFI for a great many years doing fantastic work, and tonight she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the island restoration work that she's been leading in the Caribbean. Jenny.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, with Hurricane Irma and now Maria hitting the headlines, I'm sure many of us have had the Caribbean islands on our minds over the last week or two. And without taking anything away from the horrendous impact those storms are having on people, including many friends of mine and the wildlife of this region, I'm glad to at least be able to share some good news from there. Now, this project to restore the island of Redonda actually was only officially launched last year. And given that tonight's theme is conservation success, I'm sure you're thinking with a great deal of suspicion, how on earth can she be saying anything successful in such a short space of time? But in fact, this sort of the germ of this project, the seeds of this project began 8 years ago when a team from the Environmental Awareness Group in Antigua visited the island of Redonda, was shocked by what they found there and came to me and said, "Can FFI help?" I'm smiling there. I think if I'd known what I was letting myself in for, I might not have been smiling quite so broadly. I went to see the island for myself, and there then followed years of patient negotiations, fact-finding, planning, fundraising, and as a thanks to all that groundwork, we launched the project last year and have really seen within the last 10 months a real breakthrough against two of the major problems, and already some signs of wildlife recovery, which I'm really pleased to be able to show you towards the end of this talk. So what and where is the island of Redonda? Well, Redonda is an uninhabited, very small island in the Caribbean Sea. It's about 30 miles from Antigua. It's actually a dependency of Antigua. It's remote enough and has never been contacted with other land masses, and it's remote enough to have unique endemic species. In other words, a whole host of species there that occur nowhere else in the world. Now, when Christopher Columbus passed the island and actually gave it its name, the island was lovely and green, and it had shrubs and trees and clouds of birds. When I saw the island, it was barely recognizable. Most of the surface looks like the surface of the moon. The cliffs are eroding. There's all the sediment rolling off into the sea, crushing the coral reefs below. Remarkably, it still does have wildlife. It's still got globally significant colonies of seabirds on the island, such as the brown boobies and this rather charming family of masked boobies. But nowhere near the numbers that it reportedly had in the past. I might mention, actually, if you look at the title of this paper, you might understand why I had some trouble downloading it in our office. I was caught out by the filter for porn. And it also has endemic species, including a number of, actually all of the reptiles that occur on the island are endemic to the island, including this poor tree lizard, which really has no trees left to climb. And this is the dragon, the ground dragon. Now, it may be somewhat smaller than you're expecting, but still quite feisty. And another recent discovery, actually, the Redonda pygmy gecko, which I found there during one of my earlier surveys there with the EAG and FFI in 2009. This is a full-grown adult, by the way, so you can see how they might have been overlooked before. And some rare and unusual lichens and plants, many of which actually we haven't been able to put names to yet. But beware the jumping cactus of Redonda. It really does seem to have a way of being able to throw segments of itself at you, piercing you with great force, and it's extremely hard to unpick again. But where's the forest? Where are the birds? Where's the burrowing owl that used to live there? Where are the iguanas? Where are the other wildlife that reportedly lived on Redonda? What went wrong? Well, I'm just going to run through the main cause of the problem. For about 50 years, at the turn of the last century, Redonda was mined for seabird guano. As I said, there were so many seabirds there producing this guano that was extracted, the phosphate was extracted from the guano, used for fertilizer and probably explosives as well. The mine employed over 100 workers. Sketches from this time, drawings, paintings from this time show that the island still had lots of trees and still had clouds of seabirds. The miners left at the outbreak of World War I, but unfortunately they left behind a couple of little treats for us. Number one being the ship rat, also known as the black rat, but in fact, rather confusingly, all of the ones in the Caribbean I've ever seen have all been brown. And these are omnivorous animals, here enjoying one of the cacti. But actually the ones in Redonda had evolved into this master race of ship rats, extraordinarily large, very, very common, and highly carnivorous. And I would watch in horror in the daytime with rats running around, hunting the lizards, pouncing on them, killing them, and eating them. And this is one of the ground dragons it's eating. And also attacking the seabirds, any of the birds that couldn't basically fly. Not only were individuals jumping on seabirds, but my colleagues saw rats cooperatively hunting in pairs or even fours to overcome seabirds. The other little treat were the goats on the island. Not a big herd, but enough to have a very serious impact on the vegetation on the island, preventing any regeneration of trees or shrubs. And in fact, so little vegetation remained on the island that on each visit I made during the dry season, I would just find the bodies of dead goats lying around. And you know your ecosystem, your island is seriously screwed up if even goats can't find anything to eat. Now, so even though people left during World War I and it's been uninhabited since then, the island has continued to deteriorate. Decade by decade, more species have become extinct. And the question is really, if we remove all these rats and goats or do something about them, could this loss of species be halted? Could perhaps the island even make some form of recovery? Well, FFI actually surprisingly has some experience in island restoration. In fact, we've restored 23 Caribbean islands to date by tackling invasive alien species. And the impacts of this have actually been rather remarkable and often rather quick. For example, this is Dog Island off Anguilla. This is an island actually 5 times the size of Redonda, a large island. Within the space of 2 years of removing rats, we can see already changes in the vegetation. And within 4 years, we were seeing between a 3- and 6-fold increase in the lizard populations on the island. On all the islands we've helped remove rats from, we've seen a huge increase in birds, land birds and seabirds. Here's a couple of examples of 2 islands off Antigua where we have an almost exponential rise in birds after eradicating rats. If anything else, this really shows us what impact some of these non-native mammals actually have. And not forgetting the goats and other livestock. This was a very badly eroded island off St. Lucia. We worked with local farmers to evict the goats and sheep from the island, and within about 6 to 12 months we were seeing a whole forest of trees popping up from the ground like magic. But could we do the same thing on Redonda, or was it too far gone? Admittedly, the island of Redonda was so much worse than any of the others we'd looked at before. But it wasn't FFI's island, and it wasn't FFI's decision. Of course, after that, we then went on a long process of negotiations, discussions, meetings with the government of Antigua and with various other stakeholders. Most Antiguans were absolutely fascinated by Redonda, but most of them had never actually been there, and were actually really surprised to see the pictures of what it looks like and what's going on over there. And there was a great deal of interest and a lot of discussion. Unanimously, everyone's agreed that the rats have to go, those horrible rats that were just killing everything. Nobody had any good words to say for them. But the goats was an interesting discussion. I would say the audience was somewhat split between those that said, well, this is a non-native species, it's destroying the vegetation, they're destroying our biodiversity, they have to be culled. And then there was another camp that was saying, well, actually, this is a rare breed. This is totally unlike the ones we've got in Antigua. They've been there long enough that they probably belong there. They've maybe adapted there. And maybe I don't like the lizards that much anyway. And they were arguing in favour of the goats staying. But as we gathered more evidence of the conditions on Redonda, it was very clear the goats are not living a very happy existence over there. Most of them died at a very early age from starvation. And we reached the consensus then with all the stakeholders in Antigua that the solution was to basically catch them alive and bring them into captivity, thereby saving this rare breed, but at the same time allowing the island to recover and hopefully save its remaining species. So with green light from the government and enough funding secured to at least get started, in May last year we officially launched the Redonda Restoration Programme, and here is our steering committee, or the first members of the steering committee. These are representatives from government agencies, NGOs and the private sector, but they're more than representatives. These are actually all real experts in their field. For example, we have veterinarians, we have the country's top archaeologist, we have a great forester, fisheries experts, livestock specialists, botanists, protected area management specialists, real pool of expertise which have really helped drive this project forward. And here's our program coordinator, Shanna Challenger, who is a young and incredibly dynamic and a brilliant leader for the project as a whole. Now, the Redonda Restoration Programme actually has a number of objectives, a number of goals, but the two I'm really going to focus on tonight are the rats and the goats. So the first issue is eradicating the rats, which everyone agreed was essential. Now, as I said, we've got a bit of experience in doing this, having eradicated ship rats from 23 islands to date. And we've been successful every single time, and one of the factors behind that success is the use of this particular bait, claret, which is very specific and very effective against rats. And it is one of the factors I also particularly liked about it is in all those 23 operations, no non-target casualties were incurred. In other words, we didn't kill anything, no native birds, no native reptiles, nothing else died, only the rats. So it was a no-brainer that we wanted to use this on the Redonda project as well. But what we didn't have experience in was dealing with islands this kind of shape. This was extremely steep, rugged, and a difficult terrain, and also very remote. And we really needed a good team of people. And I was really pleased that we managed to secure Biz Bell from New Zealand to be the team leader for this project. And she and I worked very closely to develop the operational plan for eradicating rats. And we hired a brilliant team of young people to carry out the operation, including, of course, climbers who could abseil and scale those incredibly high and really, really unstable cliffs. Now, to carry out the rat eradication took 2 months. The team had to live on the island throughout. It's not the most hospitable place. It's probably not what they were expecting when I said, come to the Caribbean, it'll be great. But we managed to convert or adapt one of the miners' buildings into a sort of functional meeting room, kitchen, equipment storeroom, and everyone slept in tents at night. I think we had up to about 14, 15 people staying there at any one time. Now, ship rats, as of course you all know, when they forage at night, they range by at least 50 metres, usually a lot more. And therefore, when we put out the bait to eradicate the rats, we had to put it out basically every 40 metres. We wanted to cover the whole island at least every 40 metres, so every single rat on the island would find the bait. So we worked out a grid. It was all numbered, coded, everyone knew where they were going. And the main job of the team is basically to go out, put the rat bait down, and then keep going back every day, checking how much of the bait's been eaten, what's been eating it, and replenish it as necessary. Now, I'll just show you, I mentioned earlier there was a lot of rats on the island, and I think this perhaps illustrates it. You saw there's a huge number of bait feeding areas on that island. This is just some video footage from just one of those stations, picked at random very much, and it will give you a sense of just the sheer number of rats we had to deal with. Now this is actually, the bait is actually inside a plastic bottle. It's actually a recycled water bottle, just the ends cut off, mainly so that the rats have to sit and feed on the bait and they can't just take it off and stash it. So we could really monitor how much bait was being used and make sure we weren't wasting any. There were a lot of rats. Now, thanks to their huge enthusiasm for the bait, they couldn't get enough of it. Within the space of about 2 weeks, the rat population collapsed. We continued monitoring the bait and when necessary, putting out more for a much longer period, just in case there were any last stragglers. And we also then started using monitoring tools, things like the camera traps, but also bits of wax flavoured with aniseed and chocolate and other things, just to see if there's any other rats anywhere else on the island. But no signs have been detected of the rats since March. We are continuing to monitor. Officially, we don't declare a rat eradication successful until at least a year has passed without finding any. But so far, everything's looking good. It does look like the rats of Redonda are no more. The goats were a very different story, as our main objective really was to remove them alive. Now, we looked at how other islands, other projects have been able to achieve the removal of goats alive, and we followed this method. We built a self-mustering corral. It's a sort of circular enclosure. You have to have bait in the middle, and we built this lovely trough and filled it with fresh water brought over from Antigua. And the enclosure has 2 spear gates, and these are one-way gates which allow the goats to kind of push their way in, but they can't get out. Now, the goats of Redonda were either too smart or too stupid to work this out, because absolutely none of them made their way into the enclosure at all. So we had to try other things. We went through a whole host of different methods, including net guns, which is like Spider-Man, where you throw a net at them, and all sorts of other things. We had some success with snares, live snares, caught a number of the goats this way. But the goats soon got wise to it and would either avoid the snares, or the males would use their long horns and start breaking the snares. The real breakthrough came when we started putting extra fencing across the island, and we're able to corner the goats against the fencing and catch them by hand. And this proved to be very, very successful. Now, we then had to get the goats over to Antigua, to the facilities over there. They went by air, because basically each time the helicopter came over bringing water and food and supplies for the crew, they'd take some goats back with them, including this little baby goat that Shanna's got in her bucket here, and myself with a slightly larger goat on my lap. Went back in style. And these are the goats at the facility in Antigua. Some of them you may see, some of the newcomers were actually very skinny. This kind of shows you the conditions out on Redonda. The vets were saying, well, they're very malnourished, undersized animals. But they've adapted incredibly quickly to captivity and were soon feeding out of the keepers' hands. The plan at the moment is that basically the government wants to keep some of these as a purebred herd. They also want to study them and see what characteristics they may have, for example, drought adaptiveness, possibly some genetic benefits that could perhaps be useful for their own farmers and their own breeds on Antigua. Now, I mentioned the last signs of rats were in March. The last goats were removed sort of April, May. That's a very short time. It's not very, we're now in September. Has there been any sign of improvement since then? Well, I'm going to show you a video. Just remind ourselves what the island looked like. Where is it? There we go. Remind you what the island looked like last year. Now, this was actually during the wet season. You can see a little bit of greenery where there's some trees, these fig trees hanging onto the cliffs in areas where the goats couldn't reach very easily. This may also give you a sense of the task our team had, particularly the climbers having to go up and down these, up to almost 1,000 feet high cliffs each day to put down bait and monitor it. So that was a year ago. This is our last footage from the island. Already, I hope you'll agree, quite an amazing transformation. In all the 8 years I've been going to the island, I've certainly never seen it look anything like this. Still got a long way to go, but we're going to continue monitoring and seeing how the island changes, and hopefully as the forest starts to come back. Now, to look at some of these changes in more detail, these are colleagues from the Department of Environment in Antigua who are using permanent quadrats to monitor the changes to the vegetation. We also have a raft of other monitoring tools we're using to monitor changes in the other wildlife and also in the soils and in the microclimate, because we're expecting really, radical changes to Redonda as it recovers. Just to give an example of some of the other observations we've had already, over the last few years, the only land birds we've ever seen there have been peregrines and Zenaida doves. Now already, just in the last few months, we've suddenly had a whole lot of other land birds appearing, clearly having come in naturally from other islands nearby. So already we're seeing, in just a short space of time, some really positive changes, and partly through species that are fast breeding or fast growing, probably intrinsically increasing, but also clearly natural recolonisation happening from some of the species that can fly in from other islands. And it's quite nice for me. I think this little fluff ball here was photographed quite recently, and this little chap's probably growing up never having seen a rat. And it's quite nice to think now what a change this project is having for the wildlife that live there. Now, some would feel it's probably a bit premature and probably very un-British to be blowing our trumpets at this stage. It's still very early days. But we've had some success in that the project is turning out much as we hoped it would. We still have plenty more to do, but it's so far so good. And from FFI's perspective, I think that's due to a number of factors. I'll just highlight a few key points. First of all, we responded to a locally identified need. This project was asked for by Antiguans. Antiguans had a vested interest in it from the start. They wanted it to succeed from the start. This wasn't us, a big international NGO, pouncing in and saying, we want you to do this. It's really come up from the grassroots. The second is that it's benefited hugely, I'd say, from our previous experience of having restored other islands. Certainly myself, I would in no way have dreamed of tackling an island as difficult as Redonda if we hadn't already had quite a few years of experience working with smaller, different, sometimes larger, but certainly very different islands first. We also could not have done this without having some very skilled personnel and some really good partnerships. This project required a huge diversity of expertise, and in some cases, new partners brought in that FFI's not worked with before. For example, the British Mountaineering Council, who I called up as soon as I saw the cliffs on Redonda, and they were brilliant in providing advice on how to work safely, how to find safe routes down these cliffs, and how to choose team members with the right skills. And also another really important factor was having donors and supporters who were open-minded, who could see more than just a big old rock with rubble on it, which is what it looks like at the moment, and envisage what it could be as it gets restored. And it's not an easy thing to do, and I thank everyone who has supported this project for sharing our vision. Restoring habitats, I think, is becoming an increasingly important part of conservation. Especially as the human population grows and invasive species spread more widely. It's something we've got to learn how to do and get better at doing. But it's also something that's incredibly rewarding in that it can show incredibly quick results. Nature has an amazing ability to bounce back when you lift those key threats. So all that remains then is for me to thank you the audience. Thank you all the FFI staff. And you know who you are, many of you who have helped this project in many different ways, many of you based in the office here. The FFI members, our partners, including our Antiguan partners, of course, who I'm glad to say are all well through this onslaught of hurricanes they've been experiencing and are still continuing to do the conservation work the best they can. Our field personnel and, of course, all our supporters shown on the right, who either provided funding or provided equipment, or donated their time for free. And this is just a fraction of those, especially the local businesses, many of whom gave us so much equipment and time for nothing. So thank you all, and yes, I'm sure there'll be a chance for questions later. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you very much. Another extraordinary story. And, it turns out I was wrong earlier when I said conservation can take decades and decades and decades to achieve success. And the answer, turns out, helicoptering goats. Who knew? Jenny, have you ever helicoptered any other species?
Not deliberately, but I remember Mark Rose telling us about helicoptering. Was it an elephant or something last year?
It's something we should put in our business plan, I'm sure. Okay, so we have heard two very different contrasting stories this evening. One where we've been dealing with the root cause of a challenge at some distance from the species we're concerned about, and another where we've been attempting direct intervention in the field. Both of them have given us examples of success and lessons of how they've got there. Before we head upstairs for some refreshments and hopefully further discussion, I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. I hope very much you've enjoyed what you've heard. I hope you'll leave tonight with a sense of what FFI is trying to do, how we're achieving what we're trying to achieve. You've heard from two extraordinary projects, but they are two of over 140 projects we're currently running in over 47 countries around the world. It doesn't stop here, it very much continues. Before we head upstairs, please join me once again in thanking both our speakers, Tanya and Jenny, for a fascinating and entertaining evening.